Think about managing something as, well, fundamental as fishing.
Yeah.
Making sure there are enough fish for today, but also for tomorrow.
Yeah, it's a really tough balancing act.
Especially when you think about the people whose whole lives, their communities, depend directly on it.
Absolutely. And we often jump to rules and regulations as the main fix, but uh, understanding why people follow them or don't is just as vital, maybe even more so.
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've got this really fascinating study from Vietnam. It focuses on a place called the Tam Giang Lagoon,
Mhm.
and it looks at why fishers there might not always stick to the fishing regulations, even when there's a system set up, these things called TRFs, territorial use rights for fisheries.
Right, TURFs. They basically give certain fishing rights to communities or groups in specific areas. The theory is, if people have a direct stake, a long-term interest, they'll look after the resource better.
You'd think that would sort of automatically make everyone follow the rules, wouldn't you?
You would think so, yeah.
But this study, it goes deeper. It asks why that isn't always happening. And honestly, it uncovers some things that might surprise you, even if fisheries aren't your usual thing.
Definitely.
So, if you're interested in how we manage shared resources, how policies actually play out on the ground, or just the human side of conservation, well, this is for you.
And our conversation today is based on a recent research paper.
Yeah.
It really lays out the details, the methodology, what they found.
Yeah, so our mission for this deep dive is pretty straightforward. Let's try to unpack the key reasons fishers in Tam Giang Lagoon comply, or don't comply, with the rules.
And then think about what that means, right? The policy implications.
Exactly. What can we learn? Okay, let's get into it. First up, Tam Giang Lagoon. Where is it and why is it so important?
Okay, so it's in central Vietnam. It's actually the biggest lagoon in Southeast Asia.
Mm.
Huge stretch of brackish water runs along like 70 kilometers of coastline.
70 kilometers. Wow.
Yeah, it's massive. And incredibly important. We're talking about livelihoods for around 300,000 people.
300,000. That's,
Oh,
yeah, a huge number relying on this one ecosystem.
it is. And like a lot of these vital places, it's faced serious pressure. Overfishing, resource degradation. It's a familiar story, unfortunately.
So what have they tried to do about it?
Well, they started bringing in fisheries associations, or FAs, back in 2005. Then, in 2009, they introduced these TRFs we mentioned. Both were sort of co-management tools trying to get local communities more involved.
Right, shifting towards shared management, spreading the responsibility between the government and the resource users themselves makes sense on paper.
Mm,
But the study points out, even with the FAs and the TRFs, illegal fishing is still a problem.
that's right. And it really undermines the whole point of the TRF system.
Yeah, of course.
It helps to understand there are sort of different setups in the lagoon. Some parts are common areas, open to fishers with mobile gear. Other spots have these fish corrals, more like private fixed structures with longer-term rights.
And within the turf areas specifically, what are the rules people are supposed to follow?
There are quite a few. Things like limiting who can fish there, restrictions on the type of gear like the size and number of traps they can use,
Okay.
and a really specific one. The mesh size in nets has to be 18 millimeters or larger.
Right, to let the smaller fish escape.
Exactly. And then there are outright bans on destructive stuff like electric fishing, dynamite fishing, obviously,
Hmm.
and fishing in protected zones.
Okay, so if someone's fishing in a turf zone and they're either not supposed to be there or they're using gear that's banned, like those small mesh nets, that's poaching.
Yes, exactly. Whether they're an FA member or not, if they break those rules within the TRF, it's considered poaching.
And what are the most common types of poaching they see there?
Well, the study mentions a few main ones. Using those really destructive gears, fishing in the protected areas, and significantly using nets with that mesh size smaller than 18 millimeters.
Okay, so that gives us a good sense of the place, the rules, the challenges. Now, how did the researchers actually figure out who was breaking rules and why? That seems tricky.
Yeah, this is where their method gets really interesting because, look, if you just ask someone straight up, hey, are you doing something illegal?
Well, they're probably not going to admit it.
Exactly. Social desirability bias, right?
Yeah.
So they used a combination of things. They did ask direct questions, but they also used this clever technique called the randomized response technique, RRT.
RRT, how does that work? Sounds complicated.
It's actually quite neat. It gives the person answering anonymity, essentially.
Mhm.
In this study, they had fishers roll a die, but secretly, the interviewer couldn't see the result.
Okay.
And depending on the number rolled, the fisher was instructed to either just say yes or just say no, regardless of the truth, OR. to answer the sensitive question truthfully.
Ah, I see. So the interviewer hears yes or no, but they don't know if it's a forced answer from the die roll or the real answer.
Precisely. It makes people feel safer answering honestly about sensitive things like rule breaking.
That's really smart, a way to get around that hesitation. And they use direct questions, too, to compare.
Yes. And then, to figure out what factors influence compliance, they used a statistical method, binary logistic regression. It basically helps you see which characteristics like age, education, or attitudes are linked to whether someone follows the rules or not.
Got it. And who did they talk to?
They surveyed 292 fishers from 3 villages in one commune, Quang Loi commune, back in January 2024. They noted demographics too, average age around 50, slightly more women than men, and, interestingly, quite low average education levels, about 4 years of schooling.
4 years? Wow. Okay. And what kind of fishing gear were these folks mainly using?
The most popular were things like Chinese fish traps, gill nets, and those fish corrals we mentioned.
Right.
But here's a really crucial point from the survey. The fishers generally reported they were not using the super destructive methods like electric fishing.
Oh, good.
However, using nets with mesh sizes smaller than that 18-millimeter limit. That was apparently quite popular, a common violation.
That's a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? Why avoid one type of illegal gear but widely use another?
Yeah, the researchers suggest a few potential reasons. One is perceived impact. Maybe electric fishing seems obviously devastating, immediately harmful.
Whereas small mesh nets, maybe the damage feels less direct or slower.
Possibly. Or less visible day to day. Then there's the economic incentive. Smaller mesh catches more, including smaller valuable species perhaps, which matters a lot when income is tight.
Makes sense.
Also, maybe there isn't strong agreement that 18 millimeters is the right size. Maybe it doesn't feel legitimate, practical for the specific fish they target locally.
The legitimacy factor.
Exactly. And finally, enforcement. Perhaps enforcement is much stricter or easier for destructive gear compared to checking mesh sizes on potentially hundreds of nets.
Right, practicality of enforcement. Okay, so that sets up the findings. What did they actually discover when they crunched the numbers from the RRT and the direct questions?
Well, what really stands out is the difference. Using both RRT and direct questions, the estimated rates for using destructive gear or fishing in protected areas were very low. People weren't really admitting to that, or doing it much, it seems.
Okay.
But for using the illegal small mesh nets, the non-compliance estimates were high, around 54 to 57%, depending on the exact method.
Over half. That's significant.
It is. And interestingly, the results from the direct questions were actually pretty close to the RRT estimates, falling within the confidence interval.
Which suggests?
It suggests people might have been reasonably honest in their direct answers too, perhaps because the RRT created a more trusting environment overall. Most respondents did say they felt comfortable answering truthfully with RRT.
That's good. Suggests the data is fairly solid. Okay, so we know what rule was being broken often. Now, what did the regression analysis tell them about why? What factors predicted whether someone followed the mesh size rule?
This is where we get some really key insights. Two things really stood out as increasing compliance. First, awareness.
Awareness of what?
Awareness of the negative consequences of illegal fishing. Things like knowing it depletes the fish stocks, increases competition, reduces everyone's catch in the long run. Fishers who understood that were significantly more likely to use the legal mesh size.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. If you see the bigger picture, the long-term harm, you're more likely to comply. What was the second thing?
Perceived legitimacy.
Ah, legitimacy again.
Yes. Fishers who had a higher perception that the management rules were fair, just, and necessary were also significantly more likely to follow the mesh size regulation. If they believe in the system, they're more likely to play by its rules.
So understanding the why behind the rule and believing the rule itself is fair, those seem powerful.
Very much so in this context.
What about the things we often assume drive compliance, like fear of getting caught, fines, or maybe social pressure from other fishers?
This was probably the most surprising finding. Neither social norms, what others in the community think, nor those instrumental incentives, the perceived risk of detection and punishment, had a statistically significant effect on mesh size compliance in this study.
Wow, no significant effect. That really goes against common assumptions about deterrence.
It does.
Why might that be the case here?
Well, the researchers suggest a couple of possibilities. We already mentioned how widespread the illegal mesh size use was. Maybe it's become so common it's almost normalized.
So less social stigma attached.
Perhaps. If everyone's doing it, or many people are, the social pressure disappears. And if enforcement for that specific rule is weak or inconsistent, then the perceived risk of getting caught is low.
Right, and you mentioned fairness earlier, too.
Yes, that could play a role. If people see others using illegal nets and seemingly profiting, maybe even doing better financially than those who follow the rules, it really undermines any motivation to comply based on sanctions or norms.
That's a really critical point. The perceived fairness of the outcome matters. Okay, what about the fishers themselves? Did any of their personal characteristics matter? Age, experience, education?
Yes, some did. They found that younger fishers were more likely to violate the mesh size regulations.
Younger fishers. Interesting.
And also, fishers with more years of fishing experience were also more likely to violate the rule.
More experience led to less compliance. That seems counterintuitive, too.
It does. Maybe they feel they know better, or are more set in their ways, or perhaps feel the economic pressure more keenly after many years. The study doesn't definitively say why, just observes the correlation.
Okay. What about education?
That went the other way. Fishers with higher levels of education showed better compliance with the mesh size rule.
Right, and things like gender, household size, having other income sources.
Those didn't show a statistically significant link to mesh size compliance in this analysis.
Okay, so younger, more experienced, but less educated fishers were the ones more likely to be using the illegal nets. That gives a clearer picture. So putting all this together, what are the big takeaways for policy, for managing fisheries like this?
Well, the study really drives home that effective management hinges on understanding actual compliance motivations. It shines a light on potential weaknesses in the rules themselves or how they're enforced.
And the fact that the destructive gear seems mostly gone, but the illegal mesh size use is high, that points to a very specific challenge, right?
Exactly. It tells you where the focus needs to be.
Yeah. And the things that do encourage compliance here, understanding the impacts and believing the rules are legitimate, there seem like really important levers to pull.
Absolutely.
Right.
But the researchers are also realistic. They acknowledge it's complex. Using those smaller nets might feel like an economic necessity for many fishers, especially given the high poverty rates in fishing communities around the lagoon, higher than provincial and national averages.
So you can't just tell people to stop if they feel it's their only way to feed their family.
Right. But they also stress the urgency. Using those small mesh nets catches everything, even the tiniest juvenile fish. The long-term ecological damage is severe. It has to be addressed.
Okay, so given that the usual deterrence fines, social pressure didn't seem effective for this specific rule in this context, what do the researchers suggest? What's the path forward?
Well, paradoxically perhaps, given the finding about weak instrumental incentives, they do recommend focusing on making those incentives, well, actually work for mesh size, meaning effectively implementing measures. This could involve increasing the fines specifically for illegal mesh size, and crucially, increasing the probability of being caught and sanctioned. If the risk calculus changes, behavior might too.
So make the threat real for this specific violation.
Yes. Alongside that, they strongly suggest economic policies. Tackling the root causes poverty and lack of alternative jobs.
Like what?
They mention things like supporting ecotourism or community-based tourism. Providing viable alternative livelihoods could reduce the pressure to use illegal fishing methods.
That makes sense. Offer a different path.
But they caution that these initiatives need real support, government help with skills training, investment, proper tourism management strategies. Right now, it might be a bit ad hoc.
Okay, so improve enforcement for mesh size and provide economic alternatives. What else?
Awareness campaigns. Keep reinforcing the message about the long-term dangers of small mesh nets. Really drive home those negative consequences that they found do influence behavior.
Connect it back to their own future catches.
Exactly. And linked to that, given the low education levels and the finding that higher education correlates with better compliance, they recommend targeted education programs on sustainable fisheries management.
More information, more understanding.
And finally, circling back to that crucial legitimacy factor,
Where do you build that?
enhance participation.
Yeah.
Involve fishers much more meaningfully in the decision-making processes about the rules. If they feel ownership, if they feel the rules reflect their input and local realities to some extent, they're far more likely to perceive them as legitimate.
Giving them a voice in the system.
Precisely.
The study also mentioned, almost as an aside, this issue of poaching by outsiders using destructive gear. That sounds like a whole different enforcement nightmare.
It really is. The paper notes it's anecdotally reported, but it's a serious concern. Enforcement is tough. Outsiders might have faster boats, the local FAs have limited jurisdiction, and sometimes local governments might be lax, or FA members might fear reprisals if they try to intervene directly. Plus, there's often little financial incentive for them to take on that monitoring role.
So what's the suggestion there?
Better coordination between the different FAs, finding ways to encourage safe and effective involvement of local fishers in monitoring, and critically much stronger collaboration between the FAs and government agencies to actually sanction those outside violators effectively.
Okay, makes sense. So let's try to wrap this up. If you had to boil it down, what are the core messages from this deep dive into the Tam Giang Lagoon study?
I think the key takeaways are, for this specific mesh size issue, in this context, awareness of consequences and perceived legitimacy of the rules are the big drivers of compliance.
Right.
Traditional deterrents like fear of fines or social shame didn't seem to be working effectively for this particular rule violation. And it also really highlights that complex interplay of economics, poverty, and individual fisher characteristics like age and education.
Yeah, that finding about the lack of impact from instrumental incentives and norms on mesh size is really the kicker, isn't it?
It really is.
It just underscores how context-specific fisheries management needs to be. You can't just copy and paste solutions.
Exactly. One size definitely does not fit all.
Which leads us to a final thought, really, for you, our listener. When you consider these findings, how do we design better, more locally tuned fisheries policies, not just in Vietnam, but anywhere grappling with similar issues?
Yeah, how do you strike that balance between conserving the resource for the future and meeting the immediate, very real needs and perceptions of the communities living off it today?
And what role does building that trust, that shared understanding and legitimacy we talked about, play in making any management plan actually work on the water?
Some really fundamental questions to ponder.
Definitely things to think about. And if you want to get into the nitty-gritty, the original research paper has all the details on the methodology and a much deeper discussion. We really recommend checking it out.
Yeah, it's worth it.
Yeah.
And it makes you think how these lessons might apply beyond fisheries to other areas where we manage resources and try to encourage compliance with regulations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.